The old sedan, a borrowed husk of steel and faded paint, grumbled its protest as it navigated the final, serpentine stretch of road. Dust, fine as powdered bone, plumed in my wake, settling on the parched summer foliage that clawed at the shoulders of the asphalt. This was the threshold. This was Oakhaven. I hadn't set foot here in nearly 2 decades, not since the last bitter argument with my grandmother had soured the very air between us. The summons back had been a terse, almost clinical note from the town's undertaker, followed by a phone call from a district official. My grandmother, it stated, had passed. No details, no gentle condolences, just the stark finality of death and the implicit obligation of next of kin. The official had sounded distant, as if relaying news from a great remove. Cryptic, indeed. The first sign of Oakhaven was not the cluster of houses or the steeple of the old church, but the silence. It pressed in, thick and palpable, long before the first weathered sign, Oakhaven, established 1792, appeared, half swallowed by overgrown ivy. It was a silence that swallowed the wind, muted the distant chirping of cicadas, and absorbed the very rumble of my car's engine until it felt like a trespass. The town itself seemed painted in muted sepia tones, a photograph bleached by time. The houses, mostly Victorian-era constructions with sagging porches and peeling paint, stood in unnerving uniformity along the main street. Not derelict, but stilled. No children's laughter spilled from open windows, no dogs barked at my passing, no gardener hummed over a rosebush. Even the few cars parked along the curb looked like museum pieces, coated in a fine, undisturbed film of dust. I drove slowly, the crunch of my tires on the gravel shoulder sounding impossibly loud in the pervasive quiet. My eyes, accustomed to the vibrant chaos of the city, struggled to reconcile the scene before me with the vivid, if often fraught, memories of my youth. This was not the Oakhaven I remembered, bustling with its particular brand of rural life, its small-town gossip echoing through the general store. This was a stage set, waiting for a play that would never begin. A flicker of movement caught my eye. Ahead, near the old brick building that used to house the community hall, a figure stood. It was a woman, her back to me, dressed in a simple, unadorned dress of a dull gray fabric. He was watering a small patch of marigolds, her movements slow, almost ritualistic. I pulled the car to a halt a respectful distance away, the engine dying with a soft shudder. I watched her, waiting for her to acknowledge my presence, to turn, to offer a nod of recognition or even just a curious glance, but she didn't. Her hands moved with a methodical precision, pouring water from a dented tin can onto the thirsty blooms, her head bowed. There was no sway to her hips, no casual shift of weight. He was a statue animated by a single, repetitive task. I cleared my throat, the sound a ragged intrusion. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice feeling thin, almost apologetic. She paused, the stream of water ceasing. Slowly, with an almost imperceptible deliberation, she turned her head. Her gaze met mine, but there was no spark of inquiry, no flicker of recognition in her eyes. They were wide, a pale, washed-out blue, and utterly, profoundly vacant. It was like looking into a window that opened onto nothing. No thought, no emotion, no flicker of a past shared or a present acknowledged. Funeral. The woman's lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. Her eyes remained fixed on me, unblinking, unseeing. It was less a stare and more an absence of looking away. After a long, stretched moment, she turned back to her marigolds, resuming her watering with the same unnerving, unhurried rhythm. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. It wasn't rudeness, it was something far stranger, far more fundamental. It was as if I simply did not register in her world. Deciding to seek out the undertaker directly, I put the car back into gear, my eyes scanning for any sign of life, any deviation from this unnerving tableau. The church, its white paint flaking, seemed to lean precariously, its bell tower silent. I passed the old school, a squat, brick building that stood slightly apart from the main street. I remembered scraped knees on its playground, the smell of chalk dust in its classrooms. A strange compulsion, a need to connect with something familiar, pulled me towards it. Pushing it open, I stepped into the cool, still air of the school hallway during summer with wrong decorations. The air smelled of aged paper and something faintly metallic, like old pennies. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows. But it was the decorations that arrested me. Strung across the ceiling, drooping forlornly from thumbtacks, were construction paper snowflakes and crude drawings of Santa Claus. A faded banner proclaiming Happy Holidays sagged over a bulletin board covered in yellowed, curling lists of student names I didn't recognize. It was summer, the height of it, the heat still radiating off the asphalt outside. Yet here, in this silent corridor, it was an anachronistic winter. The sheer wrongness of it, the disjunction, gnawed at the edges of my perception. It was not merely forgotten, it was deliberately, uncaringly out of place. It suggested a profound disconnect, as if the very flow of time had become disjointed within these walls. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, the undeniable sensation of being observed. Not a curious glance, but a deep, pervasive scrutiny, as if the very walls were breathing, watching. My heart began a slow, heavy thrum against my ribs. I stood there, caught between the urge to flee and the irrational need to understand. I took a tentative step forward, my shoe scuffing lightly on the polished linoleum. The sound echoed, amplified, then died away into the waiting quiet. And I, Cole, had just walked into its vast, expectant emptiness. The scent of damp earth and crushed marigolds clung to my clothes, a phantom weight I carried even after I'd retreated from the unblinking woman. I spent the remainder of the morning in a strange limbo, packing away the few personal effects I found, faded photographs, a porcelain thimble, a heavy, unadorned silver locket, each item a silent question mark against the backdrop of her cryptic demise. The lack of answers was a colder shroud than any fabric. The funeral was a sparse affair. The Oakhaven chapel, usually a beacon of weathered stone and stained glass, felt hollow, its pews mostly empty. A dozen or so townsfolk dotted the worn benches, their faces uniformly placid, their gazes often drifting, unmoored, towards the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. There was no genuine weeping, no shared anecdotes of a life well lived. Just a hushed, almost ritualistic presence. I watched the undertaker, a man whose face I vaguely recalled from childhood, guide the simple pine coffin to the altar. His movements were fluid, practiced, yet devoid of the solemnity I expected. After the brief, droning sermon delivered by the pastor, a man whose hair had gone entirely white since I last saw him, though his eyes held an unnerving, ageless stillness, I tried to approach a small cluster of attendees. "It's Cole," I offered, extending a hand to an old classmate, a woman whose name now eluded me, though his freckled face was familiar. He blinked slowly. "Cole," he echoed, the word flat, as if tasting a foreign spice. Her handshake was limp, her skin cool. "You're back." "Yes, for grandmother. It's been a long time." I paused, searching for a connection. "Do you remember when we used to sneak out to the old mill pond? Grandmother would always catch us, but she'd just sigh and give us lemonade." A faint, almost imperceptible tremor passed through her. "The mill pond," she murmured, her brow furrowing slightly, a ripple disturbing the placid surface of her expression. I think so. It was a nice place." Her eyes, however, held no spark of shared memory, only a polite, empty agreement. When I pressed further, asking about grandmother's last days, her face smoothed over. "He was always quiet, wasn't she? Kept to herself. That's Oakhaven for you." The response felt rehearsed, a stock phrase pulled from a communal well of forgetting. I spoke to the grocer, a portly man who used to slip me extra candy. "Remember how grandmother would always ask for the freshest apples, even though she swore she never ate them?" I tried, a small smile on my face. The grocer nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile on his own lips. "Ah, your grandmother." "Yes. Always particular about her apples. Good woman." But his eyes drifted over my shoulder, as if searching for something else, something just beyond his grasp. "Did she pass recently?" he asked, his voice low, almost curious, as if he were hearing the news for the first time. My smile faltered. "Yes. That's why I'm here. Her funeral." "Oh. Right. Of course." He nodded again, a rhythmic, unsettling motion. "Time moves strangely, doesn't it?" The words hung in the air, heavy and true in a way I hadn't intended. This wasn't just forgetfulness, it was a curated amnesia, a shared blankness that felt more disturbing than outright hostility. My grandmother, a woman of sharp wit and an even sharper tongue, was being remembered as quiet and particular, her vibrant personality reduced to a few bland adjectives. It was as if a sculptor had chipped away at her likeness until only a generic form remained. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and something faintly metallic, like forgotten pennies.
But it was the decorations that truly snagged my attention. Construction paper snowflakes, brittle and yellowed, clung to the bulletin boards alongside faded drawings of plump, red-nosed reindeer.
It was July, scorching and humid, yet here were the ghostly remnants of a winter holiday, months out of season, left to decay. A figure emerged from one of the classrooms, a woman with tight, graying hair and spectacles perched on his nose, the school administrator, I realized, recognizing him from my youth.
"Excuse me," I began, approaching him. "I'm Cole."
"I need to speak with the registrar." He paused, his gaze sweeping over me with an unnerving slowness. "Cole," he repeated, his voice soft, almost a sigh.
"I remember a Cole.
You were
a good student."
Her words were kind, but her eyes held a distant, almost vacant quality. I agreed, a flicker of hope that she might be different. I wanted to ask about my grandmother, too. She lived on the old Willow Creek Road. A slow shake of her head. Willow Creek Road.
It's been so long.
There was a flood, wasn't there?
Years ago.
Or was it a fire? He trailed off, him brow furrowing in a familiar gesture of strained recollection.
Things change, Cole. You leave for a while, and everything shifts.
But the road is still there, I insisted, my voice tightening. And my grandmother lived there for 80 years.
She just passed.
Passed, she echoed, a faint confusion in her tone.
I'm sorry. I must be mistaken. I thought she moved away, years ago. Moved away? Grandmother had never left Oakhaven. Not once.
This wasn't just a simple memory lapse, it was a collective rewriting, a subtle erasure.
The wrong decorations, the blank stares, the fractured recollections, they weren't isolated incidents.
They were threads of a larger, more intricate tapestry of forgetting. Oakhaven wasn't just a town of quiet people, it was a town where memories were being systematically dismantled, piece by agonizing piece. And I, the outsider, was witnessing the slow, silent decay of its very past.
The metallic tang that had caught in my throat at the registrar's office still lingered, a phantom taste of decay and something far more insidious. Grandmother moved away?
The phrase echoed, hollow and false, in the quiet chambers of my mind. He had been rooted in Oakhaven like the ancient oaks themselves, her life a gnarled, unwavering testament to this soil. It wasn't just a simple lapse, it was a collective rewriting, a subtle erasure, and a cold dread began to coil within me, tightening with each passing breath. I found myself drawn to her house, not out of any immediate need to sort through her meager belongings, but by a desperate, instinctual pull. It was a modest dwelling, perched on the edge of the woods, its paint peeling like sun-blistered skin. The air inside was thick with the scent of dust and lavender, a silent repository of her final days. Sunlight, fractured by grimy window panes, laid pale stripes across the worn floorboards, illuminating motes that danced in the heavy stillness. My hands, though hesitant, began their work. I moved through the rooms with a reverence born of grief and a growing urgency.
Her study, a small alcove crammed with books on local history and botany, seemed the most likely place to find answers.
I ran my fingers over the spines of volumes, their pages brittle with age, searching for some anomaly, some hidden clue.
Hours bled into one another.
I sifted through letters tied with faded ribbons, examined pressed flowers tucked into forgotten books, and emptied drawers filled with the detritus of a long life. It was in the bottom drawer of her sturdy oak desk, beneath a stack of old utility bills and a tangled skein of yarn, that my fingers brushed against something solid and unexpected.
A false bottom. My breath hitched.
With a surge of adrenaline, I pried it open. Nestled within the hidden compartment, wrapped in a linen cloth yellowed with age, lay a journal. The weight of it in my hands felt significant, as if it contained the very gravity of her unspoken fears. I carried it to the window seat, the sunlight now a muted gold, and carefully undid the clasp.
The first few pages were neat, methodical entries detailing garden plantings and local weather, mundane observations that spoke of a calm, ordered life.
But as I turned the pages, the script began to fray, mirroring the increasing disquiet that seeped from the ink.
Plucking at threads of memory.
Below it, a strange symbol had been drawn, a tangled knot of lines that seemed to writhe on the page. Like a microscopic organism seen under a lens.
Further on, the handwriting became frantic, almost illegible. The forgetting. It spreads like a blight. Faces blur. Names dissolve. They are taking us, piece by piece.
Another symbol appeared, a jagged, fractured circle, repeated over and over, as if she were trying to etch it into her own consciousness. My fingers traced the raised ink, a shiver running down my spine. Oakhaven's roots run deeper than anyone knows.
Our family. We were meant to watch. To remember. But the watchmen are forgetting their vigil.
A specific mention caught my eye, one that seemed to burn brighter than the rest, the old schoolhouse.
Where the echoes of forgotten lessons still linger. The Winter's Eve box.
Beneath the frost-rimmed bell.
The old schoolhouse.
My mind immediately pictured the brick building, closed for the summer, its grounds usually buzzing with the ghosts of childhood games.
The Winter's Eve box and frost-rimmed bell in summer? It was incongruous, unsettling. A gnawing certainty began to form, a thread connecting her cryptic words to the town's collective amnesia.
My determination, which had been a quiet hum, now flared into a sharp, insistent demand for action.
I had to go to the school.
The journal felt heavy, not just with its physical presence, but with the weight of its secrets. I tucked it carefully into my bag, the strange symbols now burned into my mind's eye. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and warm asphalt, typical of a summer evening. Above me, strung haphazardly from the ceiling, were faded, tattered garlands of autumn leaves, their paper edges curled and brittle, coated in a fine layer of dust. A dusty, deflated inflatable snowman lay slumped in a corner, its plastic skin cracked. It was a bizarre tableau, the vibrant promise of summer outside, clashing violently with the decaying remnants of long-past holidays inside. Every locker door, every classroom entrance seemed to hold its breath. The air itself felt thin, stretched taut, as if something vast and invisible were inhaling. It was as if Oakhaven couldn't quite remember what season it was, or what celebrations belonged to which time. They were manifesting, subtly, physically, in the very fabric of the town. My grandmother's legacy was not just a collection of memories, but a burden of terrifying truth. And now, it was mine to bear. Winter's Eve box. Frost-rimmed bell. Schoolhouse. The incongruity of it chafed at my mind. Summer's languid heat pressed against the window panes, shimmering off the asphalt outside, yet those phrases conjured the bite of December air, a hush of snow. It was a deliberate discord, a wrong note struck in a silent symphony. My grandmother hadn't been prone to whimsical riddles. Her pronouncements were typically sharp, direct, like flint striking steel. This felt different, infused with an urgency that transcended mere words. A faint shiver traced its path along my spine, despite the warmth of the room. I turned, a quick, involuntary jerk of my head, scanning the empty corners of the study, the shadowed bookshelves. Nothing. I told myself it was the journal, the weight of its secrets pressing down, stirring old anxieties. But then, it came again. I strained, holding my breath, but the house remained silent, save for the distant, lazy hum of a cicada outside. My jaw tightened. The schoolhouse. It drew me, a magnet to iron. The journal, now clutched in my hand, felt heavier, pulsing with an unspoken demand. As I walked through the town's quiet lanes, a subtle disquiet began to coalesce. I paused, frowning. The proprietor, a man named Bartholomew with a booming laugh and an endless supply of local anecdotes, rarely closed before dusk, even on the slowest days. I vaguely recalled seeing him just yesterday, his hands stained with engine grease as he tinkered with a stubborn lawnmower. Now, the shop sign hung crooked, a forgotten sentinel. I passed the hardware store, its door ajar, but the customary clang of tools against wood was absent. No one emerged. I snapped my head around, but the space was empty, bathed in unwavering sunlight. My pulse quickened. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a squat brick edifice with tall, arched windows that stared out like vacant eyes. In summer, its grounds should have been alive with the echoes of children's laughter, the distant thwack of a baseball, the drone of insects. But today, an unnatural stillness draped the entire area. The grass in the playing fields was overgrown, shaggy and neglected, and the swings hung motionless, their chains rusted. It was as if time had paused here, or simply forgotten to continue. I found an unlocked side door, its wood splintered and swollen from years of neglect. It groaned open, exhaling the cool, stale air of disuse. The interior was dim, the windows letting in only fractured slivers of light. The smell of old paper, chalk dust, and something else, a faint, sweet decay, hung heavy. It was undeniably summer outside, the air thick and hot, but here, strung haphazardly from the tarnished light fixtures, were garlands of plastic evergreen boughs, their needles stiff and unconvincing.
Tinsel, silvered and dull, draped over doorframes.
From a peg near what I assumed was the principal's office, hung a single, large, brass bell, its surface mottled with verdigris, rimmed with what looked like artificial frost. And on a small, rickety table beneath it, stood an empty, ornate wooden box, its lid slightly ajar, intricately carved with snowflakes and fir trees. The scene was a tableau of temporal perversion, a grotesque joke played by a malicious hand. Who would do this, and why? It felt as if the very air in the hallway was vibrating with unseen voices, pressing in on me, suffocating me. They weren't just peripheral blurs, they seemed to writhe, elongating, twisting into fleeting, grotesque shapes before dissolving back into the gloom.
I felt watched, scrutinized, as if the entire schoolhouse, the
very walls themselves, were observing my every terrified breath. My gaze drifted to the row of faded bulletin boards lining the hallway. Most were bare, but on one, tucked behind a curling piece of construction paper, I saw a small, hand-drawn poster. It depicted a smiling stick figure holding a balloon. Underneath, scrawled in a child's uneven hand, were the words, "Happy Birthday, Teacher Ellen." A date was written below, June 12th. I remembered Ellen Vance, the kind, soft-spoken kindergarten teacher, always a fixture at town events. I hadn't seen her since I arrived back in Oakhaven. I tried to recall if I'd heard anyone mention her. No. A blankness. It wasn't that I'd forgotten, it was as if her absence was simply unremarked upon, unacknowledged. The implications of the silent town, the shuttered store, the unacknowledged absence of a familiar face, slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just memories the entity was feeding on. It was feeding on people. It was erasing them, not just from Oakhaven's collective consciousness, but from its very fabric. Oakhaven wasn't just forgetting, it was disappearing. Piece by terrifying piece. Frost-rimmed bell. Schoolhouse. The incongruity of it chafed at my mind. Summer's languid heat pressed against the window panes, shimmering off the asphalt outside, yet those phrases conjured a chill that was anything but seasonal. Garlands of synthetic pine, faded and brittle, drooped over classroom doorways, their plastic needles shedding a fine, green powder onto the linoleum. A large, cardboard cutout of a snowman, its painted smile cracked, leaned precariously against a fire extinguisher. A shiver, not of cold but of profound unease, traced its way down my spine. I moved through the quiet corridors, the only sound the soft scuff of my shoes on the floor. Each empty classroom, each silent locker, amplified the strangeness. Then I saw it. Tucked away in a recessed nook, beneath a yellowed poster about local folklore, sat a glass display case. Inside, among a jumble of tarnished sports trophies and sepia-toned photographs of long-forgotten graduating classes, rested a small, intricate wooden box. Its surface was worn smooth by countless touches, adorned with carvings that seemed almost organic, like tangled roots or ancient script. Next to it, On a velvet cushion that had lost all its pile, sat a brass bell.
Its surface was not merely tarnished, but etched with a delicate, crystalline pattern, a filigree of oxidation that truly resembled frost.
Beneath these artifacts, almost obscured by a faded ribbon, was an old, hand-drawn map of Oakhaven. Not the modern, clean lines I knew, but a sprawling, older version, with landmarks long since crumbled or forgotten. My gaze snagged on a particular point, a large, sprawling structure on the outskirts of town, marked with a symbol identical to one I'd seen scrawled in the margins of my grandmother's journal, a stylized, three-pronged leaf. Below the symbol, in faint, spidery script, was a single word, mill. The schoolhouse wasn't the destination, it was the key, a silent archive holding the next breadcrumb. The mill. I left the strange tableau of the school, the silent halls seeming to sigh as I departed. The sun, now high and merciless, beat down on the asphalt. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to a dirt track overgrown with weeds that scraped against the underside of my truck. Finally, the track opened onto a clearing, and there it stood, the old mill. A monstrous skeleton of weathered timber and rusted corrugated iron, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world. The massive water wheel, once a source of vital power, hung broken and still, half submerged in the sluggish, dark water of the creek. I cut the engine, plunging the clearing into an even deeper quiet. As I stepped out, the ground felt soft beneath my boots, a spongy layer of moss and fallen leaves. The main entrance, a gaping maw of splintered wood, hung ajar. I pushed it open further, sending a shower of dust and dried leaves scattering across the floor. Beams of sunlight, fractured and weak, pierced holes in the roof, illuminating motes dancing in the heavy air. The vast interior was a graveyard of defunct machinery, colossal gears frozen in place, belts draped like dead serpents, hoppers choked with decades of grime. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, sweeping over the skeletal remains of industry. I moved slowly, cautiously, each step echoing in the cavernous space. The journal's words, the strange carvings, they were a compass, but a vague one. Where to begin in this labyrinth of decay? My gaze fell upon a section of the main support wall, thick with moss and grime, where the timber seemed older, more substantial than the surrounding structure. It felt different. I scraped away layers of accumulated filth with my bare hands, the rough texture of the wood grating against my fingertips. Beneath the grime, something emerged. Not the smooth, worn timber I expected, but a series of deliberate indentations. My heart began to thrum a heavy beat against my ribs. And there it was, undeniable, repeated several times, the three-pronged leaf, identical to the one on the map, identical to the one scrawled in my grandmother's journal. These were not mere decorative carvings. They felt primal. I traced the lines with a trembling finger, the wood rough and strangely warm beneath my touch. The patterns seemed to flow, to twist and turn, leading my eye downwards. It was a door, cleverly concealed, blending almost perfectly with the surrounding timber. No handle, no visible latch. I pushed, then pulled, then pushed again, applying more force. With a groan that resonated through the entire structure, the hidden section of the wall gave way, sliding inward with a deep, rasping sound, revealing a chasm of absolute blackness. This was it. Deep or beneath Oakhaven. The sun, a brazen eye in the summer sky, beat down on Oakhaven, making the asphalt shimmer like liquid glass. Frost-rimmed bell. Schoolhouse. The incongruity gnawed me, a persistent splinter in my thoughts. The old schoolhouse stood silent, its brick facade bleached by years of sun and rain, windows like vacant eyes reflecting the oppressive glare. Pushing open the heavy oak door, I stepped inside, the sudden coolness a welcome balm against the heat. But the relief was fleeting, immediately replaced by a profound sense of wrongness. Garlands of faded evergreen, brittle and shedding their plastic needles, draped across the bulletin boards, obscuring tattered student artwork. Tarnished silver bells, some still tied with limp red ribbons, hung from doorframes, their metallic gleam dulled by dust. A tinsel angel, one wing askew, perched precariously on a shelf above a water fountain. This wasn't just old holiday decor, it was a tableau frozen in a season that refused to yield to the present. It was a memory, stubbornly clinging, even when time demanded its dissolution. My gaze drifted, searching for anything specific. A small, wooden box, painted with chipped snowflakes and a rudimentary reindeer, sat on a bench beneath a window. It was empty. My eyes scanned the hallway again, landing on a janitor's closet door, half ajar. From within, I saw the glint of something. A bell, larger than the others, its surface frosted with a fine, crystalline powder that didn't melt even as I touched it. Frost-rimmed bell. It was attached to a pull chain, leading to a small, almost imperceptible seam in the back wall of the closet. This was it. I pulled the bell. No sound. Instead, a section of the wall, disguised as a stack of dusty old textbooks, slid inward with a groan of grinding stone. But the pull was too strong. The mystery too vital. The passage was rough-hewn, the walls cool and slick with moisture. It sloped downwards, a relentless descent into the earth. The air grew heavier, pressing in on me, making each breath a conscious effort. I could hear the drip of water, irregular and unsettling, echoing off unseen surfaces. The tunnel twisted and turned, a labyrinthine network of rough-hewn passages, each turn deepening my disorientation. I imagined the weight of the earth above me, pressing down, a silent, crushing presence. Then, a chamber. Larger than the tunnels, it opened up like a gaping maw. My light swept across the floor, revealing a scattering of objects. Bones. Not whole skeletons, but fragments, femurs, ribs, vertebrae, bleached and brittle, arranged in crude, concentric circles around a central, shallow depression. Nearby, etched into the rough stone wall, were symbols I didn't recognize, jagged lines and swirling patterns that seemed to pulse in the periphery of my vision, almost alive. This wasn't just a hidden passage, it was a place of ritual, of forgotten rites. The air in the chamber was different, heavier, charged with a strange, almost electric hum that vibrated in my teeth. The sweet decay smell was stronger here, tinged now with something metallic, like old pennies. My light found the source, at the very center of the bone-strewn circle. It was a growth. A pulsing, organic mass the size of a large boulder, erupting from the very floor of the chamber. A faint, internal luminescence pulsed within it, a slow, rhythmic throb that mirrored the beat of my own terrified heart. From its surface, slender, almost transparent filaments stretched outwards, disappearing into the surrounding rock, like roots reaching for sustenance. As I watched, mesmerized by a horror I couldn't comprehend, a droplet of viscous, amber liquid seeped from a fissure in its side, slowly, sickeningly, oozing down its surface. This was no mere anomaly. This was alive. This was the source, undeniably real, undeniably present. The hum intensified, a low, resonant thrum that filled the chamber, vibrating through the soles of my boots, up my legs, into the very core of my being. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a vast, silent consciousness stirring in the depths, and I was standing, a terrified intruder, at the edge of its hungry maw. My breath hitched, caught in my throat, a dry, rasping sound against the monstrous thrum. I had found it. And it was far, far worse than I had ever imagined. The sun, a brazen eye in the summer sky, had scorched the asphalt, leaving it to shimmer like liquid glass behind me. Yet, the words from the journal still whispered, an icy counterpoint to the heat that clung to my skin. Winter's Eve box. Frost-rimmed bell. It pulled me, an invisible tether, towards the squat, brick building at the edge of town, the old schoolhouse. The front doors, usually locked tight for summer, stood ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning. I pushed the heavy oak inward, the groan of hinges a discordant note in the quiet afternoon. My gaze swept over the familiar linoleum floor, scuffed with generations of hurried footsteps, but what met my eyes above the wainscoting stole my breath. Garlands of frosted pine, heavy with artificial snow, drooped from the fluorescent light fixtures. Paper snowflakes, intricately cut, were taped to the classroom doors, and a large, glitter-dusted banner proclaimed Happy Winter's Eve. The sight was a grotesque parody under the yellow glow of the hallway lights, an insult to the sweat beading on my brow. This wasn't just old decorations left up, it felt deliberate, a staged scene for an audience of one. My grandmother's journal had hinted at this, a twisted reflection of time. The bell itself was not made of metal, but a curious, milky white ceramic, etched with symbols I couldn't quite decipher. It felt ancient, heavy with a silent resonance. A low hum, almost imperceptible at first, vibrated through the floor beneath my worn boots, drawing me further. It wasn't an electrical hum, but something deeper, organic, like the sustained note of a vast, unseen instrument. Following the sound, I moved past rows of empty lockers, their doors slightly ajar like gaping mouths, until I reached the back of the building. The air grew heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else, something cloying and sweet, like decaying blossoms. The hum intensified, thrumming against my teeth, vibrating through my very bones. I pushed forward, a desperate curiosity overriding the primal urge to retreat, my breath catching in my throat. The tunnel opened into a vast, echoing cavern. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a breathtaking, horrifying spectacle. The cavern was enormous, its ceiling lost in the black, its floor uneven and damp. And in its center, gathered in a loose circle, were the townsfolk. I recognized them immediately: the shopkeeper, his usually jovial face slack and smooth, the postman, whose perpetually furrowed brow was now eerily serene, a colleague from the town council, her sharp eyes unfocused, gazing into nothingness. There must have been 30 or 40 of them, standing or kneeling, their bodies still, their eyes vacant, reflecting the faint, pulsing light that seemed to emanate from the very air around them. Their faces, usually etched with the small anxieties and joys of daily life, were wiped clean. Yet, I could feel something else in the air, a fragmented mosaic of emotions, a raw, exposed nerve of shared experience. It was as if their very consciousness was being peeled away, layer by layer, and offered up to the unseen. A thick, root-like growth, pulsing faintly with that same sickly light, snaked from the cavern floor, intertwining with the townsfolk's feet, binding them subtly to the earth. It wasn't a physical restraint, but something more insidious, a connection that seemed to draw their essence. Their individual selves were dissolving, their unique narratives merging into a single, placid pool. It was not a violent force, but a gentle, persuasive current, promising peace, an end to the gnawing fear, an escape from the relentless burden of memory. Join us. Be free of the struggle. Be one. My own memories flickered before my eyes, vivid and sharp, my grandmother's stern but loving face, the scent of her lavender sachets, the feeling of the rough journal paper beneath my fingers. I would not surrender. Not yet. My memories, once vibrant and fiercely mine, flickered like dying embers, each precious image a fragile barrier against the encroaching tide. My grandmother's scent, the rough texture of the journal, the fierce love in her gaze, these were the anchors, the jagged rocks I clung to, even as the collective consciousness whispered promises of peace, of ultimate belonging, of a surrender so complete it was indistinguishable from oblivion. A surge, cold and deep, threatened to pull me under. But within that hum, a dissonance, a sharp, defiant spark. It was the memory of my grandmother's last, desperate entry, the ink smeared with urgency, hinting at a fight, a struggle to retain what was hers. That defiance, that refusal to yield, resonated within me, a tiny, furious ember fanned by her legacy. My mind, a desperate fist, clutched at the fragments of self, refusing to let them scatter. A jolt, like an electric shock, ripped through me. It wasn't pain, not truly, but the agony of severing an unnatural bond, a tearing sensation deep within the core of my being. I was falling, then scrambling, my limbs uncoordinated, clawing at something rough and damp. I pushed, panicked, through a narrow opening, my shoulders scraping against crumbling rock. My breath hitched in my throat, ragged and loud in the absolute stillness. I stumbled over loose stones, my hands raw, driven by a primal need to be free of that suffocating embrace, that vast, silent mind that had almost consumed me. The tunnels were a grave, not for bodies, but for selves. Finally, a faint, sickly yellow light ahead. I pushed through, my body aching, my mind still reeling from the psychic assault. I emerged, gasping, into a place that made no sense. A tinsel garland, dull and shedding its silver flakes, drooped forlornly above a classroom door, its plastic holly berries cracked. My escape had landed me not in the familiar, decaying streets of Oakhaven, but in this incongruous, unsettling stillness. It was a place out of time, a physical manifestation of the town's fractured reality. I leaned against a locker, its dull gray metal cool against my burning cheek, my chest heaving. The sheer, overwhelming relief of being me again, of having distinct thoughts, distinct memories, was almost as terrifying as the assimilation itself. It wasn't death that this entity offered, it was erasure. The entity didn't kill, it consumed identity, memory, the very essence of personhood, leaving behind only a quiet, uniform hum. That was the true horror, a fate far more insidious than any physical demise. Her cryptic notes, her hurried sketches of ancient symbols and strange, almost musical notations, suddenly resonated with a horrifying clarity. She hadn't been trying to destroy it, not exactly. He had been trying to sever its connection, to isolate it, to cut off its feed. Her research wasn't about eradication, but about disruption. He had spoken of a resonance, a frequency or a pattern that sustained the entity's hold, a subtle current flowing through the town's oldest structures, its very foundation. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning for familiar diagrams, for the recurring symbols she'd meticulously copied. There it was, a specific sequence, a series of notes she'd called the counterchord, accompanied by a drawing of a central point, a nexus. My grandmother had left me not a weapon, but a blueprint for a shield. My identity, a pebble on that endless beach, had not quite dissolved. The echoes of shared thought still hummed at the edges of my perception, a silent choir threatening to drown out my singular voice, but I had pulled back. The raw, desperate struggle for my own mind had left me trembling, but also ignited a fierce, cold resolve. This was not just Oakhaven's fight, it was deeply, violently mine. Its worn leather cover, its familiar scent of aged paper and dried lavender, anchored me to a reality that was rapidly fraying. I needed answers, something concrete to push against the encroaching tide. The town, once a collection of distinct lives, now moved with a horrifying, synchronized grace. I needed a place away from the main streets, somewhere quiet, yet unsettling enough to mirror the truth of Oakhaven. The old schoolhouse, its brick facade cracked and ivy-choked, called to me. Its emptiness, I hoped, would offer a temporary sanctuary. I pushed through the warped main doors, the groan of hinges echoing through the cavernous space. A faint, sickly sweet aroma, like decaying flowers, permeated everything, a subtle counterpoint to the dry air. Fluorescent lights, long dead, left the corridor in a perpetual twilight, broken only by slivers of sun piercing through grimy windows. But it was the decorations that truly twisted my gut. Garlands of faded red and green tinsel, strung haphazardly, drooped from the ceiling, their metallic sheen dulled by time and grime. Near the principal's office, a cutout of a cheerful pumpkin, its paper edges curled, leaned against a poster advertising a bake sale from years past. A plastic reindeer, one antler broken, stood sentinel by a row of lockers, its vacant eyes staring into the gloom. Christmas in July, Halloween in August, spring flowers in December, the entity's influence had not just consumed memories, but scrambled the very fabric of time, leaving these visual non sequiturs as mocking monuments to a town that no longer understood its own calendar. My footsteps, usually a soft scuff, sounded impossibly loud against the linoleum, a jarring intrusion in the profound silence. I pressed my back against a locker, its cold metal a momentary comfort. I needed to find a way to rally them, these fractured souls. An indistinct murmur drew my attention to the far end of the hallway. Two figures, a man and a woman, moved with that same unnerving uniformity, sweeping invisible debris from the already spotless floor. I recognized them, the town's former librarian and the retired baker. Their movements were slow, deliberate, each sweep of their phantom brooms perfectly synchronized. "Eleanor?" They paused, their heads tilting in unison, like marionettes on a single string. Their eyes, once lively and full of stories, were now placid pools, reflecting nothing but the dim light. "Do you remember the annual pie contest, George?" I pressed, trying to inject warmth into my tone. "Your apple pie, the one with the lattice crust? Everyone said it was the best." A flicker, a barest tremor in the baker's left hand, a momentary tightening around his eyes, then it was gone, replaced by that same vacant calm. Eleanor, the librarian, offered a small, placid smile, devoid of recognition, her gaze drifting past me as if I were a ghost. "The books, Eleanor," I tried again, my voice growing desperate. "The rare edition of local folklore you kept hidden in your office. You always said it held the town's true history." Nothing. Their eyes remained blank, their movements resuming their slow, rhythmic sweep. It was like speaking to reflections, beautiful and empty. The entity's grip was tighter than I'd feared. I retreated, my heart a dull ache in my chest. If even a direct memory, a beloved personal triumph, couldn't pierce the veil, what hope did I have? I sank to the floor, my back against the cool metal of a locker adorned with a tattered paper snowflake. The journal fell open to a page marked with a pressed autumn leaf, incongruous in this summer-decorated school. My grandmother's elegant script filled the page, dense with observations and archaic symbols. The breaking of the personal thread. To disrupt it, to wound it, one must reintroduce the friction. The dissonance. The stubborn, vibrant clamor of individual memory, held fast and asserted. It wasn't enough to have memories, one had to actively remember, to assert them against the encroaching nothingness. The journal then mentioned a catalyst, a focal point for this act of defiant recall. The echo stone, my grandmother had written, her hand pressing harder on the page, leaving an indentation. A fragment of the original standing stones, imbued with the echoes of ancient Oakhaven. It amplifies the human spirit's capacity for remembrance, creating a ripple in the entity's placid sea. It was lost generations ago, hidden from the first assimilation, deep within the oldest roots of the town.
My breath hitched. The Echo Stone. A relic. A way to fight back. The remembering wasn't just passive recall, it was an act of rebellion. A faint hum, barely perceptible, began to thrum through the floor beneath me. It was the vastness stirring, sensing my defiance, my renewed focus. I could almost feel the tendrils of its consciousness reaching, probing, trying to draw me back into the comfortable, silent ocean. But my grandmother's words, the weight of the journal in my hands, grounded me. The task was monumental, perhaps impossible, but the path was clear. I would make them remember. I would make the town remember itself, one defiant memory at a time. Fluorescent lights, sickly and intermittent, cast long, wavering shadows that danced with a life of their own. It was a space frozen in a perpetual, unsettling twilight. Streamers, faded and brittle, hung in listless loops from the ceiling, their cheerful colors leached away, remnants of a celebration long past, or perhaps, one that never truly happened. A banner, proclaiming "Welcome back, students," in peeling glitter, seemed a cruel jest, its message a hollow echo in the profound silence. My boots scraped on the linoleum, a harsh intrusion in the otherwise muted air. Each locker, a dull, metallic slab, stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but the dust motes swirling in the stagnant air. The scent was a strange concoction, the ghost of old floor wax, the metallic tang of forgotten keys, and something else, a subtle, cloying sweetness, like decaying flowers or overripe fruit, a smell that felt utterly wrong within these institutional walls. I gripped the Echo Stone in my pocket, its rough surface a grounding presence. This was it. The reckoning. I could feel the entity's presence growing stronger. With every step, a low, resonant hum vibrating not in the air, but in the very marrow of my bones. The hallway twisted, not physically, but perceptually, the lockers seeming to stretch and recede, the walls breathing. It was a memory, a phantom limb of Oakhaven, twisted and repurposed by the entity, a path to its heart. The air here was thick, heavy, carrying the same cloying sweetness, now tinged with something mineral, like damp earth and forgotten minerals. Below me, a precipitous drop, and in the chasm's depths, the entity. It was not a creature of flesh and blood, nor a stone and sinew. Shifting, nebulous forms coalesced and dissolved within its depths, like dreams half remembered, like faces glimpsed in a crowd and instantly forgotten. Within its shifting luminescence, I saw them, fleeting images, fragments of memory. A child's swing set, rusted and abandoned. A couple dancing in a forgotten town square. The stoic face of a fisherman, etched with the salt and sun of generations. A woman weeping silently by a window. These were the collective, fragmented memories of Oakhaven, woven into the entity's very being, fueling its silent, inexorable growth. A deep thrum resonated through the cavern, a vibration that felt less like sound and more like a direct pressure on my brain. It was the entity's voice, a chorus of swallowed thoughts, a symphony of forgotten lives. Not Oakhaven's. I focused, channeling everything I had learned, everything I remembered, every individual story I had salvaged.
I thought of the old storyteller, his voice raspy with forgotten tales. I channeled the cacophony of individual human stories, the vibrant, messy, beautiful chaos of distinct lives, and I pushed them outward, through the stone, towards the pulsating mass. The thrum intensified, becoming a sharp, jarring discord, a furious vibration that threatened to shake me apart. It fought back, not with physical force, but with a torrent of forgotten pain, of loneliness, of the crushing weight of insignificance that precedes assimilation. It was trying to erase me, to make me a part of its silent whole. A wave of profound weariness washed over me, a yearning for peace, for the cessation of struggle. It was the entity's most insidious weapon, the promise of quiet, of an end to the burden of self. But then, a flash of my grandmother's fierce gaze, a memory of her defiant laugh, pierced through the haze. He had fought it. I pushed harder, focusing on the sheer individuality of each memory, each story. The distinct crunch of leaves underfoot in autumn. The unique tang of my grandfather's pipe tobacco. The specific way the sunlight slanted through the kitchen window on a Tuesday morning. It was not just the content of the memories, but their very uniqueness, their refusal to blend, that was the weapon. The entity shrieked, a soundless scream that reverberated through the very air, rattling the stones of the cavern. This wasn't merely assimilation, it was an active erasure, a fundamental negation of what it meant to be. My breath hitched, a terrifying clarity washing over me. This thing sought to unmake the very concept of distinct life. I felt a searing pain in my temples, as if my skull were being pried open. My own memories were slipping, dissolving, becoming mere echoes. The echo stone grew hot in my hand, vibrating with the strain. I was risking everything, my very identity, to break this thing, to give Oakhaven back its voice. Repelled by the encroaching void. I thought of my grandmother, her eyes sharp with stories, even as they dimmed with age. These were not mere recollections, they were anchors, each one a defiant spark against the swallowing gray. A terrible pressure built behind my eyes, as if my skull itself were a bell struck by two opposing hammers. The entity, that vast, hungry silence, recoiled with a shudder that vibrated not through air, but through the very marrow of my bones. It was a psychic scream, not heard with ears, but felt as a tearing in the fabric of what was. The collective consciousness, once a suffocating blanket, convulsed. My singular, stubborn memories, amplified by the desperate will I poured into them, were a poison in its veins, 1,000 dissonant notes ripping through its carefully cultivated harmony. It didn't explode, it simply broke, like ancient glass crumbling into glittering, meaningless dust. It was too much, a raw, unfiltered deluge of half-formed sensations and forgotten names. I staggered, clutching my head, a searing pain blooming behind my temples. My knees buckled, and I fell, the world spinning in a dizzying kaleidoscope of what felt like a million unfinished dreams. Overhead, a forgotten string of tinsel, faded and dusty, drooped between two fluorescent lights that buzzed with an unnerving hum. A deflated balloon, emblazoned with a crudely drawn ghost and the words "Happy Halloween," was taped next to a bulletin board covered in construction paper cutouts of snowflakes and reindeer. It was July, and the incongruity was a fresh wound, a tangible echo of the fractured reality that had become Oakhaven. I pushed myself up, my muscles aching, my head still throbbing. Through a nearby open doorway, I saw a handful of townsfolk. The librarian stood rigid, her hands pressed to her temples, a faint tremor running through her frame. Their faces were etched with a profound confusion, a dawning realization that something vital had been missing, and now, in its sudden return, they were lost. A low moan escaped the baker's lips. He was sitting on a bench, clutching a small, tarnished silver locket. His eyes, usually crinkled with good humor, were wide and moist. My! She loved these. He opened the locket, revealing a faded, miniature portrait. He seemed to remember the face, the name, but the stories, the texture of their life together, were still just out of reach, like smoke. He wept, a quiet, broken sound. Other memories, like scattered embers, flickered to life around me. A resident stopped mid-stride, a look of vague recognition crossing his features as he glanced at the Halloween decorations. Didn't we put those up for the Harvest Festival? He murmured, a question hanging in the air, unanswered. The dates, the seasons, the very flow of time seemed to have been scrambled, leaving behind a jarring collage of forgotten festivities. The victory, if it could be called that, tasted like ash and regret. I had broken the entity's hold, shattered its silent dominion, but at what cost? Oakhaven was not restored, it was wounded, traumatized. The collective memory had been violently dislodged, leaving gaping holes, phantom limbs of identity. Their laughter, their familiar greetings, their shared history, much of it was gone, perhaps forever. They were like broken dolls, missing key pieces of their stuffing. The houses stood as they always had, but they felt different, haunted not by ghosts, but by the absence of their own stories. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of unremembered joys and sorrows. My grandmother. A surge of grief, fresh and sharp, pierced through me. The entity's disruption had allowed her memory to return, vivid and painful. I had saved Oakhaven, but I hadn't saved her, not really. Her stories, her essence, had been part of the battle, used as a weapon. The profound choice settled upon me like a heavy shroud. I could try to rebuild, to teach them new stories, or piece together the remnants of the old ones. Or I could leave. The wind rustled through the ancient oak trees that gave the town its name, a sighing sound that seemed to carry both sorrow and an indifferent promise of endurance. I stood on the dusty road, looking back at the houses, at the lingering confusion in the eyes of the townsfolk.